So if I may have your attention, so appreciate all of you coming and joining us today. We're delighted to have special guests in Steve Ford, and I want to thank right off the bat all of our friends at the Ford Foundation, Ford Presidential Library and Museum for helping make this event possible. When Marty Allen mentioned to me that Steve would be in town, I said, you know, I think our leadership fellows would really appreciate being able to hear Steve's perspective. Now, Marty's going to give the formal introduction of Steve Ford, but let me just say that sitting at lunch with him, he's a guy with a lot of interesting stories, observations, and background. You will enjoy him enormously. It is my pleasure at this point to introduce Marty Allen, the Chairman Emeritus of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation. Marty, would you please introduce him?
Well, I'm finally enjoying my emeritus title after holding it for a little over a year or so. And the reason I have are three people that are here that are making that possible. Joe Calarusa, who's the new executive director of the foundation, Elaine Didier, who's the director of the museum and library, and Diane Van Allsburg, who is the administrative assistant for the whole foundation and has been with me since you were there with the museum before I started, but it's been around 81 when I started. So those are the people who have allowed me now to enjoy my emeritus title. We all know that on August 9th, 1974, there was a rather dramatic change in the president's life. And at that same time, it certainly affected all of his children, too, not the least of which was Steve. And he'll talk a little bit about that today. Among other things, currently, he does a number of guest lectures on a variety of subjects. That we will cover some of that today, but he's a very popular person on the circuit. But I think that probably some of the things that you might like to know about or recall, I could do this in the form of a test to see, looking at the age differences here and not sinking out anybody in particular. But for example, he has been a long time person that you've seen on the screen in television. Now, let me ask you this. Has anybody ever watched Young and Restless?
Will they admit to it?
Well, he spent 6 years on that show as Detective Andy Richards, for those that have seen it, you probably remember. And I have to tell this because I know that Steve would verify it, that when Young and Restless came on, when he was in that show, the president used to go into his office and close the door and not be disturbed so that he could see his...
That was because his secretary Penny was addicted to the show.
Maybe even more so, other than commercials and all the shows he did on television besides Young and Restless. He's really well known for being in movies. Now this is going to really be a test. He's done over 30 of them, and maybe now I'll hit more of the students when I mention these. They were all feature films, and one of them was Black Hawk Down. Anybody here see Black Hawk Down? Now you see I'm getting the young. He was in Contact with Jodie Fisher. He was Foster, excuse me. He was in Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. The one that I think most people would recognize is he was Meg Ryan's boyfriend in the movie When Harry Met Sally. So I feel a lot of people know that. Now, if you're really into the movies lately, his most recent film was Transformers, and he played a general. Maybe your age is beginning to catch up with you.
That's right, yeah.
He's truly a cowboy. He'll talk to you a little bit about that. But he was on the rodeo circuit at one time. He is a rancher by life now. He has a ranch out in California, and so he has usually when I call him about 11 o'clock in the morning Grand Rapids time, which is 8 o'clock this time, because he said he's up early, but he didn't tell me that he's usually out on the ranch fixing fences or doing all those good things that cowboys do. He's a wonderful young person, and to all of us that have been involved with the Ford Foundation over the years, and it's just a delight for me to introduce you to Steve.
Marty. Thank you very much. And it's funny. I think back on some of the movies I worked on, and I played Meg Ryan's boyfriend in the movie When Harry Met Sally, and it amazes me that they actually paid me to kiss Meg Ryan. That to me is. But Marty's right. The last big movie I worked on was the movie Transformers, and I was a 3-star general, and I had worked for that director. The director of that movie was a guy named Michael Bay, who directed Pearl Harbor and a lot of big movies, and I worked with him on a movie called Armageddon about 10 years ago. And when I was in Armageddon, I was a colonel, and he made me a 3-star general in Transformers, and I started feeling old, Marty. That was, so, but it's been a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun working in the TV and film business. I was going to school out in California, Cal Poly University. I was an ag major, animal science major, and the way I got in the TV and film business, I took a summer job. I was rodeoing at the time, professionally, and I wasn't that good, but I was having a lot of fun doing it, and rodeoing. And a friend of mine was producing a movie down in Mexico with Rod Steiger and Burt Lancaster. And you'd have to be a little older in this room to know those actors. And it was a Western, and they needed some guys that could fall off horses. And I was doing it for free, and they were going to pay me, so I thought that would be a pretty good job. So I went to Mexico for the summer. I was a junior in college, and spent about a month and a half down in Mexico falling off horses with Burt Lancaster and Rod Steiger. And I remember they gave me one line in the movie, and it was a Western. Honest to God, this is a line, and I always thought this was a joke. And Burt Lancaster and Rod Steiger ride up to me on horses, and I actually say, "They went that-a-way." I'm the guy that said that, and I said it very poorly. I was not very good. But what I remember about that is I had no, great love for acting, or I just did this. It was a summer job, and I knew how to ride a horse. And I remember they paid me about $5,000 for the summer. A month and a half. You're a college kid. I didn't think I had to work again. I thought, when you're in college, $5,000, this is 1979, you could live the rest of your life off of $5,000. So came back from Mexico, and what happened, I went back to school, but I developed a love for the TV and film business, acting. And on the weekends, I was still going to college. On the weekends, I would drive down to Hollywood, and I would study acting and take some classes, seminars. And I started going on interviews while I was still going to college, and got an agent. And one of the first jobs I got was on Happy Days. And I played, again, had a few lines, and I played Al's cook. And Fonzie thought I stole money from Al, the guy that owned the little restaurant. And I have this scene where Fonzie confronts me. Now, you got to remember back, 1979, 1980, Happy Days was the big, that was the #1 show for 8-9 years. That was like the CSI of, it's hard to believe. But, so I had this scene with the Fonz, and that was a big deal for me to work with the Fonz. And just to let you know, I'm not getting rich in the film and TV business. At that time, they paid you $800. This was the schedule, the normal for any actor. You got paid $800 for a guest appearance on a comedy. And you rehearsed from Monday to Thursday, and then on Friday, you shot it live in front of a 3-camera audience, and it went out on TV. The residual, the next time it ran on TV or film, you got another $800. Those checks kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller over the years. About a month ago, I got a check from that episode of Happy Days that, originally was 1980, I think. And I don't know where it aired. It could have been in China or Russia or Italy, and subtitles and everything. Now remember, I got $800 back in 1980. The check I got the other day, the gross amount was 9 cents. And after Uncle Sam took out taxes, the net was 6 cents. That's what I got. So I'm actually not going to cash it. I'm going to frame it, put it on the wall, and there's going to be some accountant sitting somewhere going, I can't find that 6 cents. So, what the stamp cost? How much does the stamp cost? I mean, just to mail it to me. So I've been very blessed working in the TV and film business, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm going to share with you today just some stories of our experiences at the White House, and it was a very unique time because our family was never supposed to be there. I mean, if you grew up a son or daughter of the Reagans or the Bushes, or you could almost predict that your father was going to run for president and maybe become president. But Gerald Ford, I don't think anybody thought Gerald Ford was ever going to be president someday. So before I get started, first of all, thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be here. Dad loved coming back and participating locally. There's Grand Rapids and Grand Valley, and this was he had a heart for this place. This is where he grew up, and our family owes Grand Rapids particularly a lot for giving Dad a wonderful place to grow up as a young man, and the state of Michigan, and it was just a great place to find those values, integrity, character, leadership values, and Grand Rapids is an all-American city that provides that for young people, particularly when Dad was growing up. So we owe a lot to this area, and Dad loved Grand Valley. So thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. I met with a couple of students back here, and when I was coming in, somebody asked me, now with a new administration, do you get invited back to the White House and stuff like that? It's a small club who's lived there, and my comment was, well, when Dad was there, the key turned kind of to the right, and now it kind of goes to the left, so our key doesn't really work anymore. But the last time, and Marty, you were there, last time I was at the White House was when we had Dad's 90th birthday, which would have been, 5 years ago, whatever, in the summertime. It was 2 or 3 years before he passed away. And President Bush was kind enough to invite my dad back to the White House, our whole family, to celebrate Dad's 90th birthday. And it was almost to the day that he had been sworn in as President of the United States 30 years earlier. So, I hadn't been to the White House, Marty, in probably 20 years, I bet you. And so the President Bush, was kind enough. They were going to have a little reception for us on the family quarters, and then we had dinner that night. But he took us over to the Oval Office, and I walked in and I thought about it. I thought, my gosh, first of all, I haven't been here in 20 years, but I was an 18-year-old kid when Dad became president. And I'm walking in the Oval Office thinking, how did I ever, become part of this? And I'm looking around to see if it's all the same. It looks the same. Then we go up to a small reception on the second floor of the White House before we go down to dinner. And I'm wandering around thinking, this was the family quarters, this is where we lived. And again, even though I lived there, I'm thinking it was just surreal that our family got catapulted into the White House. And I walk out, there's a screen door that leads out onto a balcony. I think it's a Truman balcony. It looks over the south lawn of the White House. And I walk through that screen door, and I look over, and to my left, in a perfect line, is Vice President Dick Cheney, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan, and then me, and we're standing in this perfect line. And in my head, I'm going, this doesn't make sense. And it's like one of those pictures, like what doesn't belong here? You know what I mean? So I asked Alan Greenspan to leave, and no. But we went down to dinner. We had a wonderful dinner, and so that was the last time I'd been back to the White House. So this is, it's not a club that you get invited every week, and we were very blessed to go through it in 1974, and I want to share a few of those stories with you of how we got back there and how our family became one of the, you think about it, it's so unique. Dad really, the first man that became president of the United States that didn't go through an election. He was appointed vice president, assumed the presidency after Nixon resigned. That probably will never happen again in the history of this country. Let me give you before I get started here, I'll give you a little background of what I do today besides acting. I do, as Marty said, a lot of corporate events and things like that. But I went, and I think it relates to what this is about leadership and character. I went through a huge change myself about 9 years ago. And I had three very special people, about 9 years ago, stand in front of me and challenge me. And they said, Steve, we love the movies you work on, we love the TV shows, all those kind of things, but we challenge you to step away from your acting career and do something different, to be of service, to add more value to your life. And those three people, they did, 9 years ago, challenged me, and I listened to them, and I did. I walked away from my acting career for about 2 or 3 years to go be of service, as they called it. And gave up income, all those kind of things, and that was easy to do. I didn't have a family to support, so that was a easier decision for me than most. But I took off and took 2 or 3 years, and I started traveling around speaking to high school kids, middle school kids, college kids about drugs and alcohol, because of what the Ford family had gone through, 25 years earlier, when my mother, former First Lady, raised her hand, said, my name is Betty, I'm an alcoholic. And that changed the face of alcoholism in this country back in the late 70s. And you would think Betty Ford's son would know better, but 15 years ago, I too had to raise my hand and say, my name is Steve, I'm an alcoholic. And that's how sneaky a disease it is. And I should have known better. I mean, my mother was Betty Ford, so actually, to let you know, our family's just like everybody else's. When I went to my mother 15 years ago and told her, I think I'm an alcoholic, she was just like every other mother in this country. And I remember going and saying, Mom, I think I'm an alcoholic. And she said, no, my son can't be an alcoholic, you can't be an alcoholic. I said, Mom, wait a second, you can't be in denial. You're like Betty Ford, you're the poster child for this thing, And she was just like every other mother, so we're all the same. But I stand here sober today, 15 years of sobriety, due to Mom's leadership, the grace of God, and a good 12-step program. So I was able to take my failure at that time and what I learned from that to get sober and go speak to high school kids, middle school kids for about 2.5, 3 years. Spoke to about 65,000 of them. To be of service, to add more value to my life. And the other thing I did is I took off and I started working with some overseas relief organizations all around the world. Been in prisons in Mexico and been in Africa many times. And one of my trips to Tanzania, East Africa, it's very interesting. We went over there to work with kids that their parents had died of AIDS. And you go there and there's a couple generations of children that are not going to have parents because their parents have died of AIDS. Some of the numbers are, 1 out of every 3 women in parts of Tanzania have AIDS, 1 out of every 4 men. And we'd stand there with hundreds and hundreds of children in these church and school courtyards, and how they kept a smile on their face, I have no idea. But I was over there. They asked me to give a speech in Tanzania. The first time I went over there to East Africa, my first trip I was there about a month. And I'd just gotten in the country, didn't know much about the country and the people yet. And they asked me to speak to about 4,000 Tanzanians sitting on the hillside there. And I had a translator with me, a friend of mine. His name was Daniel. He lived there in Tanzania. And we're walking to the podium, and I'm going to speak to all these people, and he's going to translate my talk. And I turn to Daniel, I say, Daniel, I just got here. Please tell me a word in Swahili so they'll know I'm trying to learn their language or culture and everything. I say, how do you say welcome in Swahili? And he says, Mr. Steve, you say jambo, J-A-M-B-O, jambo. So I walk to the podium, they have a mic, and I grab the mic, and it's beautiful, afternoon, people sitting on the hillside. And instead of saying jambo, which means welcome, I say jamba. I put an A on the end instead of an O, and 4,000 people laugh at me. I have no idea what I just said. I know I didn't say jambo, though. So I give my little talk. Daniel, he translates it, And we go sit back down, and I turn to Daniel, my translator, and I say, Daniel, I meant to say jumbo. He said, oh, Mr. Steve, you did not say jumbo. I said, yeah, but I meant to say jumbo. No, you said jamba, very, very bad in Swahili. And I go, great, what did I say? And he says, well, jumbo in Swahili means welcome. But jamba in Swahili means you let gas. They haven't invited me back, so no, they have. I've gone back several times. Wonderful country, wonderful people. There's a wonderful story. I don't know if Elaine knows this story or Marty knows this story. Our family, it was really about transformation and change. I mean, to go from the Nixon administration to Jerry Ford, the guy from the Midwest, it was about going from a president who was about secrecy and, there was a paranoia and he had an enemies list, to Jerry Ford, a guy from Grand Rapids, Michigan, opened his life to everybody, and it was a transparency as far as the two different presidencies. And that's this idea of change and transformation. There was this great story that happened, must have been a little over 8 years ago. Dad was back at the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia. And they asked him, he gave a short speech there. My mom was there with him. And on the way back to the hotel, Dad had a mild stroke. They raced him to the hospital there in Philadelphia. And Mom was with him. The kids, we weren't back there. And we all flew back that night. And Dad had to go in for what they call exploratory surgery to deal with this stroke and everything. So we sat with Dad in his hospital room the night before the surgery. And, we did what you do with your father when he's getting ready to have surgery. We're talking to him, holding his hand, we're praying with him, encouraging him, and getting him ready for surgery. And the next morning, I'm standing outside the recovery room as they're bringing Dad out from the surgery. And this man walks up to me and says, I want to tell you how much the world has changed. And to me, it sounded like a heavy European accent. He says, when I first saw your father, he was my enemy. I was a 14-year-old boy in my country, and I saw your father get off the plane on my Russian TV to meet with President Brezhnev of Russia to deal with nuclear arms. I was a 14-year-old Russian boy, and I saw your father back in, must have been 1975. He was my enemy. And here I am some 20 years later in this part of this hospital and part of that team in there during that surgery, helping save your father's life now. That's change. That's transformation. And I thought about it, and I walked out of there and went, my gosh, this guy was a 14-year-old boy. He saw my father, and Dad I think he was over there with the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. They were dealing with that, and he's just a young boy, and he sees my dad in the Cold War, and he's my enemy, and here we fast forward 25 years later, and he's one of the medical staff saving my father's life 25 years later. That's change. That's transformation. That's how much the world is changing around us all the time. So that story just always fascinates me. And it makes me think, do I live my life in a way that allows that kind of change and transformation to happen in my own life? That's just kind of a question I ponder all the time. I see I've gotten off track already, so I'm going to get back on track here. And I know we've got a limited amount of time, and then we'll do some question and answer. I'll share with you how our family got catapulted into the White House. It was October of 1973. At that time, Richard Nixon was president of the United States. His vice president was Spiro Agnew, who got caught in a bribery scandal, had to step down from office, and Richard Nixon was looking for a new vice president. And there was a list of probably, possibly 5 to 10 people that might be considered as the next vice president. That list would have looked Governor Nelson Rockefeller, John Connally of Texas. Those kind of people were the names probably at the top of that list. Dad's name was on that list, but I think we all thought that Dad's name was at the bottom of that list. He'd been a congressman here from Grand Rapids for 13 re-elections, 26 years. And my mother had finally got Dad to retire. He was not going to run for Congress. And we were talking, Hillary, you said you ran his last campaign, and we were talking, Dad, Mom had not wanted to be the wife of a politician, and she'd endured living in Washington, D.C. for 20-some years. Finally got Dad to retire, and he was going to serve out that term, and they were going to move back to Grand Rapids and live here. Except Richard Nixon changed all that. We were told, all the people that might be selected as vice president, they were told that at 7:30 that night, the White House was going to call whoever they chose to be vice president. Then they were going to announce it nationally at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We lived in a little house outside of Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Virginia. And that night, Dad got called. We were having dinner, and the phone rang, and General Alexander Haig was on the other end of that line, and he said, Congressman Ford, the President of the United States has something that he thinks both you and your wife Betty should hear at the same time. And they got on the phone, and Richard Nixon asked him to be his next vice president. Now, this didn't make my mother really happy. She was ready for retirement in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I remember my dad getting off the phone and talking to her later and saying, Betty, don't worry, vice presidents don't do anything, And history proved that wrong. So, but that was October 1973. At that time, Watergate was a pretty small item in the news. It was not what it would become later, and over the next 10 months, Watergate grew, and 10 months later, August 1974, Richard Nixon stepped down from office and Dad became president, took over the reins of this country at a tough time, very difficult time. I remember I stood out on the south lawn of the White House, and I think a lot of us remember that picture of Richard Nixon on the steps of the helicopter saying goodbye to his staff, family, and friends on the south lawn of the White House. We saw the helicopter leave. We went in, walked into the East Room of the White House. They were going to have a very small swearing-in ceremony. And to sort of paint a picture of, here we just went through an inauguration of a new president, and what we saw was galas and balls and celebrations. That's not what this was. This was a very, very dark moment in American history. You had a man who was going to go in, take the oath of office that had not been elected by the American people. He had not gone through a general election to be elected as president. You had the Vietnam War going on, Cold War with the Russians. The economy was in shambles, had one of the worst recessions since the Depression was going on. 12 months before my dad became president, to paint the economic picture, actually very similar to what we're going through today, 12 months before he became president, the price of oil on the free market, a barrel of oil was $3 to $4. Over the next 12 months, the price of oil jumped over 400% to $12 a barrel. Now, can you imagine today if the price of oil went up 400%? Unemployment was hovering around 6.5% at that time. It would later grow over the next 2 years to about over 8%. You had inflation that was starting. You had a war in Vietnam, a Cold War with the Russians. This was a scary time. This was a constitutional crisis because you had a man who was going to take the oath of office that had not been elected by the American people. So we went into the East Room. Mom held the Bible. Dad took the oath of office. But the country was scared. The country was concerned. That night, I remember after the swearing in, we went into the Oval Office and took our first family portrait behind the desk. It had been cleared off. Nixon had cleared off his desk, and Dad laid down the Bible, and we sat there and took a family picture. And it was very strange because I started thinking, wait a second, 10 months ago my dad was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I would have walked by the White House and those gates and fences just like everybody else and looked through them and wondered what the heck they do in the White House. And here, 10 months later, our family has been catapulted over that fence. Very unique time. So, now, this is funny. You would think after your father becomes president of the United States, you get to live in the White House, right? That night, because Nixon had left so quickly, unexpectedly, with the resignation, they were not able to pack all their clothes and their belongings. So even though President Nixon and his wife Pat left and went to California, they left their daughter and son-in-law, David Eisenhower, at the White House for the next 7 days to pack up all their clothes and belongings. So that night, after Dad takes the oath of office, he becomes president, we don't get to move in. We have to go back to our little home in Alexandria, Virginia, and go back, and we live there for 7 or 8 days before we get to move in the White House. And you ladies out there are going to appreciate this. I will never forget my mother standing over the stove that night going, "Jerry, something's wrong here. You just became President of the United States and I'm still cooking." That was our reality. It's just what it was. And the next morning, can you imagine, the next morning my dad walks out on the front steps of our little house in suburbia and commutes to the office, which is the Oval Office. And literally there are neighbors of years, 20 years, are standing on the street corner there yelling, "Great new government job, Jerry." I mean, that's really what it felt like. So, which, if you think about it, was probably a very healing thing for the country. You'd gone from this President Nixon, who had an enemies list, and there was a paranoia and all these things, very secretive, to Jerry Ford, this guy from the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was a good thing to happen for the country, a very good thing, even though Watergate had happened. So, I've got so much I could tell you. I'm just kind of trying to hit some of the highlights here, and I know we want to do some question and answers. I guess I'll touch on the Nixon pardon for just a second, and then I want to share with you probably the biggest lesson I've learned since Dad's death, I guess, since he passed away, and when you have a chance to look back on what his life was about. So it's interesting. The economic times we're facing now is the same thing Dad faced. The stock market, 6 months before Dad became president, was over 1,000 points. In the next 6 to 8 months, the stock market back in 1974 dropped over 45%. It was down to about 560, and you had an energy crisis. You had oil going up 400%. You had inflation while Dad was president, got up to 14.5%. You had unemployment that in some parts of the country reached over 8-9%, particularly in Michigan, Detroit, the auto industry. You had a war in Vietnam. Today we have a war in Iraq. The good news I would bring you is that even though Dad was president only 2.5 years, when he got out of office, the stock market was back over 1,000 points. He'd gotten all the troops home from Vietnam. Inflation, he was able to cut inflation from a high of 14.5% down to about 4.2%. and created about 4 million new jobs, and the economy started rolling again. So that's the good news. We'll get through whatever we're going through. We've been through it before. It's interesting because Dad worked with a Democratic Congress, and they butted heads a lot. That Democratic Congress at that time wanted to spend their way out of the recession, and Dad was a moderate, conservative, certainly fiscally conservative Republican, and his biggest fear was building up the deficit. And he was trying to keep the budget at that time below $300 billion. What's the budget now? We're talking trillions, right? His fight in 1975 was he drew a line in the sand and said he was not going to let the federal budget go beyond $300 billion. He looked back, and this is the way he thought. He looked back and he saw in the early 1900s and 20s and 30s, the budget was usually no more than 5 to 10% of gross national product. And he saw it grow in the 60s and 70s, and now it was up to about 25%. And he saw that trend of carrying so much debt and deficit was just not good. And I could tell, I was saying at lunch, that's not how he lived at home. At home, I'll never forget the day, and this is the way Dad thought. the day he came home and we celebrated the day he paid off our mortgage. I'll never forget that day. I was just a little kid. And he came home, he was so happy. He says, "I've paid off our home loan. We're debt-free." And that's the way he thought. And that's the way he ran his family, and that's the way he thought the federal government should not carry that kind of, deficit spending. And my mom used to call him and say, "Jerry, you're so tight." And he'd say thrifty. He thought thrifty was a better word. But you know what? Our family always slept very well because of the way he handled our personal family finances. We knew that about him. And that's the way he looked at the federal government. He got in a tremendous amount of trouble and bad headlines when New York City was going broke back in 1975, and they needed a federal bailout. And the headline was, "Ford tells New York City drop dead." But now, eventually, yes, did he, working with Congress, get New York City some bailout money? Yes, he did. But first, he told them they had to get their own financial house in order. And they had to solve some of the high salaries they had and overextended pensions and things like that. So that's where he came from economically. So he dealt with a Congress that was almost 2/3 Democratic. He had very little, but he vetoed a lot of spending. 66, I think it was 66 vetoes. A lot of I think about 15% of them got overridden. But he prevented Congress from spending their way out of the recession. So that's how he approached it, and he felt very strongly about that. It's interesting, when he left office, he'd cut inflation, jobs were growing again, the Dow Jones was back up, we were out of Vietnam, but what's the one thing he's remembered for? The pardon of Richard Nixon. And that's probably the one thing that his presidency will always be remembered for. It's a decision he would never change. Cost him an election against Jimmy Carter. They figure the pardon cost him 10 to 15% of the vote in 1976 against Carter. They lost by, 1%. So the pardon definitely probably ended his political career, but he never would have changed his mind. A little background on the pardon. After he became president, he called in the leaders of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, called them to the White House, asked them what was going on. They said, "Mr. President, we have a war in Vietnam, we have a Cold War with the Russians, we have runaway inflation, unemployment, and we're still spending 25% of our every day in Congress dealing with Richard Nixon." Because there were still criminal charges pending against Richard Nixon, even though he had resigned. And Dad was spending 25% of his every day in the White House dealing with Richard Nixon. And he felt very strongly the country needed to move on to get with what was going on with the war, the recession, the important things. He called in Lee and Jaworski, the special prosecutor, and asked him how long Nixon could maybe drag this out in the court system. And the answer was, 3, 4, maybe 5 years. And I think that's what made Dad's decision about he had to get Nixon out of the way so the country could move forward. And they came up with the idea of the pardon. And at that time, they knew they weren't going to be able to get Nixon to say he did anything wrong. That was not going to happen. Obviously, he came out in his books later and admitted to those things. But they based their pardon on a Supreme Court case back in 1933, the Burdick case, where a man had been held in federal custody. His name was Mr. Burdick, and the federal government had come to him and said, we'll give you a pardon if you'll testify for us in a case. He refused the pardon because the Supreme Court had ruled that by granting a pardon, it was an implication of guilt. And if you accepted a pardon, it was an acceptance of that guilt. Mr. Burdick turned the pardon down. It was called the Burdick case. They went to Nixon and they said, we're going to grant the pardon on this basis. By granting it, it's an implication of guilt. If you accept it, you accept that guilt. Nixon initially turned it down, would not take it under those terms. This negotiations went on for 2 or 3 days. Finally, Nixon came back, said he would accept it under those terms. And pardon was given. Basically ended Dad's political career. But it did get Nixon out of the way, so the Congress and the President could work on the most important things that were dragging the country down at that time: the war in Vietnam, the Cold War, the recession. It came full circle, though, because I'm guessing, what, 15 years ago, maybe, he was invited back to the John F. Kennedy Museum and Library by Caroline Kennedy and Senator Ted Kennedy, and received the John F. Kennedy Award for courage in public service because of the Nixon pardon. And trust me, I don't think he ever thought he'd be standing on the same podium with Senator Ted Kennedy, and Senator Kennedy handed him an award for the pardon. Because, you know, Senator Ted Kennedy basically, back when Dad granted the pardon, said, you know, he'd sold the country out by pardoning Richard Nixon. But it came full circle. And a lot of people saw that that was a courageous thing to do at the time. The selfless thing. You know, it didn't help his political career, but eventually it helped the country heal. And so that was very, very unique. I don't think Dad ever thought he was going to get that award. So, but it did work out in the end. So, you know, and I tell you that because we think so short-term today, short-term. Nobody thinks long-term anymore. It's short-term fixes, now. You want results. Nobody thinks long-term anymore. So, kind of an interesting story. I'll close with the most important thing I've learned since my father's passing. And I think it does have to do with character and leadership. I was about 4 months before my dad passed away. I was down in Beaumont, Texas, in a federal prison. And I wasn't in the prison. You realize that, right? I was down there. I was doing what those 3 people asked me to do. I was being of service. And I was speaking to about 200 inmates in that federal prison. And I was telling them, these were 200 men that were trying to get off drugs and alcohol and, you know, transform their lives. And I was in there telling them my story and what the grace of God had done in my life to get sober. And spoke to the men and told some stories and what my journey was to get sober. And then we did a question and answer thing afterwards. And a lot of guys got up and asked questions and stuff like that. And this one young man stood up and they were wanted a question about Dad's career, his accomplishments. And I thought about it, and this was about 4 months before Dad passed away. And I said, you know, my dad is not in the best of health right now, and I don't know how long he's going to live. Could be 2 months, could be 6 months, could be a year. But I said, you know what? At some point, I'm going to be standing on the Capitol steps in Washington, D.C. at a state funeral. And I said, I promise you that when I'm standing there, the greatest value of my father's life at that moment is not going to be what he did in his career, of how he got all the troops out of Vietnam, or how he cut inflation from 14.5% down to 4.2%, or that's not going to be the greatest value. I said the most important thing is going to be how he led our family, what kind of father he was, what kind of leader of our family he was. And so we got in this discussion. That young man said, well, tell us a great story about his character, not his career, his character, who he was. And I thought about it, and a lot of stories ran through my head, but the favorite story of mine that I think sums up who Dad was, and it was at a very young age. So it had nothing to do with trying to plan out a political career or a move of that type. It was when he was a young man. And it's a story about what happened when he was at the University of Michigan playing football. And this is a story I shared with those 200 men in Beaumont, Texas, in that federal prison. The same story I'll tell you today. We went back about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer. They retired my dad's jersey at University of Michigan. Whole family went. We stood on the field that day. I'll never forget it. They were playing Michigan State, and they retired Dad's jersey. And this was when Michigan was still winning games. And and we stood there. They retired Dad's jersey. He had tears in his eyes and everything. It was a wonderful day. And there was a guy pulled me aside and said, I want to tell you a story about your father's life. And he said, your dad and I knew your dad when he was playing football at Michigan in 1932, 33, and 34. And he says, 1932 and 33, I think Michigan was undefeated both years, 10-0, national champions, right? And he told me the story. He says, in 1934, your dad was captain of the team, most valuable player, one or the other. I forget which one it was. And in 1934, Michigan was going to play a team, Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech was an all-white school. And Georgia Tech found out that Michigan had one black player on its team. I think his number was number 61, Willis Ward. And Willis Ward was a star of the Michigan football team. And Georgia Tech in 1934 said, we will not take the field. We won't play the game this weekend if Willis Ward suits up for that game. Now, first of all, this isn't a story about Georgia Tech, because there were plenty of other universities and colleges at that time in 1934 that were doing the same thing as Georgia Tech. That was the norm. The man who was telling me the story said, your father was so incensed. He thought that was so wrong that his good friend Willis Ward could not play in that game, that he was going to quit the University of Michigan football team to make a stand for his friend Willis Ward. And your father wrote his father back here in Grand Rapids and wrote him a letter and said, Dad, I'm going to quit the University of Michigan football team because my good friend Willis Ward can't play in this game. And I guess Willis Ward heard about it. He was touched by it. He went to my dad, told him, look, Jerry, you got to play the game. I'll sit down. Convinced my dad to go back on the team. Now, they played that game that weekend against Georgia Tech. Willis Ward didn't suit up. Michigan had come off 2 undefeated seasons, 1932 and 33. In 1934, their record was 1-8. They won 1 game and lost 8. But the only team they beat was Georgia Tech, 9-2. And I'm standing there at Ann Arbor 10 or 12 years ago, hearing that story about my father's life. For the first time, I have tears running down my eyes. And that man looks at me and says, son, do you know what character is? To be honest with you, I couldn't speak. I'd never heard this story. Tears running down my face. He goes, character is what you do when nobody's watching. And nobody was watching your father's life as a young 20-year-old kid at the University of Michigan. And so that story to me sums up who Dad was and what his leadership skills were, who he was as a young man. And, I think Grand Rapids, I think the people that were in his life, his stepfather, his mother, all those people played a role in getting him to that level, and it certainly prepared him to be president someday. So, just close by trying to think. Oh, I'm going to tell you who those 3 people were that challenged me. I knew I needed to do something here. Those 3 people that got me to walk away from my acting career for 2.5 years, 3 years, go speak to 65,000 high school, middle school kids, go to Africa, prisons in Texas and Mexico and stuff. Those 3 people were my 3 teenage nieces, Sarah, Becca, and Hannah, my brother Mike's children. Those little girls were 12, 14, and 18 at the time. And they stood in front of their uncle and they said, Uncle Steve, we love the movies, love the TV shows, all that stuff, but we challenge you to do more with your life, to be of service. And that, to me, is great leadership. I got from 3 little girls. And I think about it, and sometimes, I don't know if you run a business or whatever you do, sometimes the smallest people in our organizations come up with the brightest ideas. But you got to listen to them. You got to think about it. And I stand here today grateful I listened to those 3 little girls and followed that. So thank you all very much. It's great speaking with you, and be glad to do some question and answers afterwards. But thank you very much. Oh, I forgot. As you think of a question, I'll share this with you real quickly. This was my. I just graduated from high school when Dad became president. And he became president in August. I graduated high school in June. And I was getting ready to go. I was been accepted to Duke University. I was supposed to start my freshman year at Duke University in about 2 or 3 weeks. And all of a sudden, Dad becomes president, right? I get 10 Secret Service agents. Trust me, at 18 years old, that ain't really the group you're hoping to hang out with. I'm trying to visualize moving into the freshman dorm at Duke University with 10 guys with machine guns and radios, and it really didn't work for me. So I said, I can't go to college right now. I said, I'll go next year. So I walked into my dad's office, which is the Oval Office right now, and I walk in, and I said, Dad, I'm just not ready to go to college yet. He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, you just became president. I've got 10 Secret Service. I said, I want to take a year off. I'll go back to college next year. And that, that's the last thing your father wants to hear. What? He sent the tuition money and everything else. And it's not like he doesn't have more important things to think about, right? And so he goes, well, what do you want to do? And I say, Dad, I've always had this dream, this vision of going out west and being a cowboy. He's like, what? A cowboy? At least he wasn't a rock star. I want to join a band. No. I said, I want to go out west and be a cowboy. And so, thank God I had parents that allowed us kids to kind of follow our own heart. And so, I didn't go to Duke. I took off 2 weeks later, loaded up my Jeep, and I headed to Montana and started working on ranches, cowboy and rodeo. I'd never really ridden a horse before. I mean, I'm serious. I told these guys at lunch today, I'm not sure I knew which end to feed, let alone how to ride one. But went to Montana, took my 10 Secret Service agents. It was what was the movie Billy Crystal did? Cities. Yeah, that's what it was like. Okay, these guys, we took their coats and ties off and put cowboy hats and boots on them and stuff like that. So, but the story Marty is referring to is when I was working on ranches, most of the time, if I was riding a horse, they could usually follow me in a pickup truck or something like that. But we had one occasion where we had the ranch I worked on in Montana was about 25,000 acres, surrounded by Forest Service land. And it was common practice, you leased land from the Forest Service and you ran your cows up in the leased land during the summertime and got them off at the end of the summer, and you pastured them up there. Well, we had done that all summer, and we'd gotten most of our cattle off the Forest Service land, but there were like 3 or 4 old wild cows that were still up there. So the Forest Service called us and said, you need to get these cows off the mountain. So we loaded up a truck and a stock trailer with 3 horses. One horse for myself, 1 horse for this other cowboy who worked on the ranch, and 1 horse for this Secret Service guy who he just transferred in from like Miami, Florida, right? Here he is in Montana, there's a foot of snow on the ground, So we drive up top of the mountain and we're unloading the horses, right? We're going to go look for these 3 cows, and I'm getting ready to unload the Secret Service guy's horse. And all of a sudden I hear this voice behind me. It goes, just leave my horse in there. I go, what? I look back and there's the Secret Service guy. Just leave my horse in there. I go, what are you talking about? He goes, look, I'll just stay here at the truck. You guys go play cowboy. He says, you'll come back here. Nobody's going to know the difference. We'll all go home together. Nobody's going to know. He says, there's nobody up here who's going to kidnap you or shoot you. There's nobody up here. I'll just stay at the truck. So that was fine with us. He didn't really know how to ride a horse, so we left the Secret Service guy at the truck. Myself and this other cowboy, we take off and we ride for maybe 2 or 3 hours looking for these cattle. We don't find any. We're headed back to the truck, and I look over, and this other cowboy on his saddle has a Winchester lever-action 30-30 hunting rifle. And, you're 18 years old, you get to thinking, wouldn't it be funny if we shot this gun off 3 or 4 times so we knew the Secret Service guy would hear it, right? And then when we get close to the truck, I'll get off my horse and lay over the saddle like I've been shot, right? And we'll see what he thinks of staying at the truck. So we shoot this gun off 3 or 4 times. We know the Secret Service guy hears it. We get close to the truck. I take my cowboy hat off, hanging on the horn of this other cowboy's saddle. He takes the reins of my horse. I climb over the horse, lay over the saddle. He comes riding around the horse, leading my horse. I'm laying over the saddle. Secret Service agent looks up, sees me laying over the saddle, jumps out of the truck, and the first words out of his mouth, he goes, "My career, my career." He doesn't ask if I'm dead or alive. That's your government tax dollars at work right there. Is that the story you meant, Marty? Yeah. So, any other questions? We have some questions you want to ask? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I've grown up here in Grand Rapids for a number of years. My family's originally from here. But I kind of grew up with stories of your father. My grandparents knew him as a rival football player. My mother went to the same high school as him. I was wondering, what kind of places your father talked about when he talked about Grand Rapids?
You know, Grand Rapids to him, first of all, I don't know if you know this, you know, Dad wasn't born here. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska. And his original name wasn't Gerald R. Ford, it was Leslie King. He was, when he came to Grand Rapids, he was born, for you all that don't know the story, he was born into a family. His biological father was named Leslie King and Sr., and Dad was born Leslie King Jr. And the problem was that his father, his biological father, he was born in Omaha, Nebraska, was very abusive to Dad's mom, my grandmother, Grandma Ford. And there was quite a bit of abuse, physical abuse that went on. In fact, the first night she ever got beat was on her wedding night. And beatings got worse and worse and worse. And finally, she left with Dad as a young boy. He was just a child. And she fled Omaha, Nebraska, and went across the river there to Council Bluffs, Iowa, and waited for her father to take a train down from Illinois to pick her up and take her back to Illinois. They moved back to Illinois. She filed for divorce because of the physical abuse. But at that time, the shame was so great for a young woman, a single mom with a child, that her father, they had to sell their business in Illinois, and they ended up moving to Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so she got here, and she met a man. She finally got a divorce. She met a man, Gerald R. Ford Jr., and met him here, I think, at Grace Church. And they dated, and they got married, and he never officially adopted my father, but they changed Dad's name from Leslie King to Gerald R. Ford Jr. And that was a man that invested in my dad's life. You think about it, he's the one who made sure he had the right school teacher, the right church pastor, the right football coach, the right Boy Scout leader, so Dad became an Eagle Scout here. Grandpa Ford, who was not a biological father to him, but was the real father to him and invested in his life. And it proved to me at that point that it's love, not blood, that raises kids. His real father, his biological father, was nowhere to be seen. But Grandpa Ford, who was the man who loved him and blessed him and invested in him, is the one that got Dad, gave him the character, the integrity to really become president someday. But you know, I hear old stories about South High, and when we were growing up, Dad used to take us out to the beach, and we'd go to Holland, and he'd tell us stories about growing up here, and you know, when he was before he went to college, he went through the Depression here, and his father had the Ford Paint and Varnish Company, and you know, there were all kinds of economic hardships. They lost their home at one point, and Dad wasn't supposed to go to the University of Michigan. When he got out of high school at South High, his high school principal called him in, said, "Jerry, what are you going to do now you're out of high school?" And Dad said, "You know, it's Depression. We don't have any money. You know, I can't go to college." And his high school principal wanted him to go 1 year to the University of Michigan, but Dad said, we don't have any money. He wanted Dad to go there and play football. And so his high school principal said, "Jerry, we're going to set up a scholarship. We're going to loan you $100. You'll be the first recipient, so you can go 1 year to the University of Michigan for $100." Now, obviously, it's a little more expensive than that now. But Dad was the first recipient of that fundraiser. And he went to the University of Michigan and ended up being able to stay there for 4 years, figured out a way out to do it. But a lot of great memories of his childhood here. And again, it was just an all-American city. I think it had the values that were good for a young man. So, another question. Yes?
Growing up in politics, seeing your father was a congressman and then president, is there anything that made you not want to get into politics or why you chose not to get more involved?
Meg Ryan. Meg Ryan politics. No, I'm joking with you. I think growing up in politics, and probably because it changed, politics today, I hate to say it, has become so toxic. It's not a user-friendly place anymore. There was a different style, there was a different fabric of when Dad was a congressman and how they did business in Washington and Capitol Hill. One of Dad's best friends was Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House. And at the end of the day, they knew how to shake hands or go across the aisle at the end of the day and still have a friendship. In fact, one of the greatest quotes that I've ever heard about Dad's life came from Tip O'Neill. And Tip O'Neill said, now I'm going to get this close, but not exactly right. Tip O'Neill, in his book, said, God has been very good to America. God has been very good to this country. During the Civil War, it sent Abraham Lincoln, and during Watergate, he sent Gerald Ford, the right man at the right time to heal this nation. Now that is a quote from a Democratic Speaker of the House to a Republican. And that tells you the kind of friendships they had back then. It doesn't happen anymore. Politics today has become so toxic. And I hate to say that, but it has. And that's what would I would shy away from running for office. And listen, I'm just an actor. What kind of politician would an actor make anyway? I do, but please.
Yeah, they say that leaders learn even more from their mistakes than from their successes. And did your dad share with you the mistake that he made at some point in his career that really gave him insight into how to lead better?
Boy, that's Dad was very humble about the decisions he made and things that didn't go well. I think he would look back and his career would show a career of when you made a mistake, you weren't afraid to go back and find the right solution, because the solution was the key. It wasn't there for your glory or your ego. Dad was a public servant. He loved serving the public. I mean, that's all he wanted to do. And I think you look at early parts of his administration, not the Nixon pardon, that was not a mistake, but economically, they made some poor choices economically when they were trying to solve the economy. They had the whip inflation now, which was it turned out not to be a good program. It didn't work. And early on in Dad's administration, he at that time, he thought the answer to helping the economy was a tax surcharge to the American people, a one-time tax surcharge, I think it was 5 to 10%, to help get money for programs. And they ended up going a different direction. They gave a tax break. So the first solution was wrong. Whip inflation now did not work. But they learned their mistakes, and they went back and worked with Congress, and they came up with a way to cut taxes for the American people. I think Dad's recommendation was about a $16 billion tax cut. Congress, when the budget went through, it turned out to be about a $22 billion tax cut, much more than he wanted. But he put conditions on it with Congress, again, working with Congress, saying you can't raise programs, build new programs. You've got to keep the budget down under this $300 billion cap kind of situation. So, early on he made some, and then he went back working with Congress. And again, it was for the American people. It's not who gets the glory. So I guess that would be the answer to the question: is if you're truly a public servant, it's not about getting your name on it. It's about, does it do what it's supposed to do for the American people? So, yeah. One more question maybe, and we'll get you out of here. Yes, sir.
What did your father have to say about energy and energy security? Because I know it started with Gerald Ford, and it's gone on for decades.
They talked about, this country being energy independent back then, and the problem is we get sucked into this delusion every time oil prices go up. We all get excited about it, and we're going to do something about it, and then oil prices go back down, and we forget about it, and we have cheap energy, and then oil. So it's been going on since my dad's administration. Every president has talked about the idea of being energy independent from OPEC, and nobody's followed through, because it's going to take sacrifices by the American people, and we get so used to cheap gas that we forget about it. But when gas was, I don't know what it was back here, but in California, I was paying over $4 a gallon. I was pretty interested in energy independence at that point, But now it's down to, $2.25 or whatever. I've become less, that's human nature. It's going to cost us, in the short run, to be energy independent. It's going to cost in building that kind of technology. But OPEC is very smart. And they know every time we get all excited, all of a sudden energy prices come down. And it's like being a cocaine addict. I hate to say it, but we're addicted to cheap energy. And hopefully we're going to do something about it, because we'll be in big trouble if we don't. Yeah.
Steve Ford, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation that was so personal. I mean, it combined the personal angle with so much insight about leadership, and to have a speaker come in and be able to give both of those was truly a pleasure and a treat for us. And as a token of our appreciation, I'd like to give you a Ralph Hauenstein tote bag.
All right. Thank you all very, very much. All we can is try to fill in for Dad, and we'll never be able to fill his shoes, but we're honored that any of us would be asked to come back and still be part of this community. And Dad loved it here in Grand Rapids, and he loved Grand Valley. So thank you guys very much.
Thanks a lot, Steve.